The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on western Germany. April 16, 1945. The time read 14:20 hours. Dust particles danced in the heated air. The landscape stretched before them like a moonscape. Craters dotted the earth in random patterns. Shell holes filled with stagnant water. The smell of cordite still hung heavy. Feldwebel Werner Hoffmann pressed his back against the bunker entrance. His uniform was stained with sweat and grime. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. 3 years of fighting had aged him beyond his years. What he witnessed now challenged everything the army had taught him. Everything he understood about warfare was crumbling before his eyes. The scene unfolding across the broken terrain defied logic. Nearly 3,000 German soldiers moved across the battlefield. These weren't raw recruits or old men. These were battle-hardened veterans, men from elite units, the 9th Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, survivors of the bloodiest campaigns in military history. They had lived through the hell of Normandy. The beaches ran red under their feet. The hedgerows swallowed entire companies. Yet they had fought on. They had endured the nightmare of the Ardennes. Snow turned crimson around them. Artillery shells screamed overhead for weeks. Still they had pressed forward. 3 brutal years on the Eastern Front had forged them in fire. Soviet tanks charged their positions in endless waves. Machine guns chattered until the barrels glowed white-hot. Comrades fell beside them daily. Yet they had held the line. Now these same warriors walked deliberately toward American positions. Their hands rose high above their heads. White cloth fluttered from rifle barrels. This wasn't panic. This wasn't terror driving them forward. Something far more powerful was at work. They moved with purpose. Each step was calculated. Their formation remained disciplined even in surrender. This behavior puzzled every military manual. Defeated armies fled in chaos. They scattered like leaves before the wind. They fought to the last bullet or ran in terror. These men did neither. They chose surrender with the same discipline they once chose battle. Within 2 weeks, this phenomenon would spread like wildfire. Over 300,000 German soldiers would lay down their arms. The largest mass capitulation in recorded military history was beginning. By war's end, the numbers would stagger the imagination. 500,000 soldiers in the Western theater alone would choose surrender over death. What force could break an army that had conquered most of Europe? What weapon could convince these battle-tested warriors to simply stop fighting? Men who had faced Soviet steel at Kursk. Soldiers who had withstood Allied bombardment at Monte Cassino. Veterans who had launched Hitler's final desperate gamble in the Ardennes. The answer wasn't found in any weapons laboratory. No superweapon caused this collapse. Not the atomic bomb. Not jet aircraft. Not secret technology hidden in underground bunkers. The force destroying German resistance was far more subtle, far more insidious than any conventional weapon. This weapon attacked minds rather than bodies. It targeted will rather than fortifications. It made soldiers question their most basic assumptions. The Americans had discovered something revolutionary about modern warfare. The most effective weapon wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to make killing unnecessary. German forces faced something beyond military defeat in those final months. They confronted a systematic psychological operation of stunning effectiveness. An assault on their minds so overwhelming, it convinced hundreds of thousands of soldiers that surrender was logical, not just preferable to death. The only choice a rational thinking man could make. This was Operation Tailwind, the classified American psychological warfare campaign that didn't destroy the Wehrmacht. It convinced the Wehrmacht to destroy itself from within. The bunkers still stood strong. The weapons still functioned. The ammunition supplies remained adequate. But the will to use them had evaporated like morning mist. The war's final months would prove that the human mind was the ultimate battleground. Hearts and minds determined victory more than tanks and planes. When soldiers stopped believing in their cause, they became more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy. The Americans had weaponized doubt itself. The Ardennes forest loomed dark and forbidding in the winter of 1944. Snow covered the ancient trees in blankets of white. The problem that would lead to Operation Tailwind began here. Hitler's last desperate gamble was about to unfold. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. Despite being pushed back across France, the Wehrmacht had shown something terrifying. Even in retreat, they fought with devastating effectiveness. Even facing certain defeat, they maintained their killing power. American intelligence officers stared at calculations that made their blood run cold. Reports flowed into headquarters throughout November 1944. The numbers painted a grim picture. Defeating Germany would require fighting through the Siegfried Line. This defensive network stretched like a concrete serpent. 18,000 bunkers dotted the landscape. Tunnels connected strong point to strong point. Fortifications spread across 390 miles. From the Netherlands to Switzerland, the line bristled with weapons. Behind that barrier lay the Rhine River. German engineers had turned it into a moat, protecting the fatherland. Every bridge was prepared for demolition. Every crossing point was fortified and defended. Machine gun nests commanded the approaches. Artillery observers called down fire on anything that moved. Beyond the Rhine lay the industrial Ruhr region. Intelligence estimated 400,000 German troops had turned every city into a fortress. Every building became a bunker. Every street corner a killing ground. Urban warfare was the most costly form of combat. Each block would demand payment in American blood. The projections arriving on commanders' desks were horrifying beyond imagination. General Omar Bradley's staff worked through the night calculating casualties. Taking the Ruhr alone could cost 50,000 American lives. Dead boys who would never see home again. Clearing the Siegfried Line might require another 100,000 casualties. Wounded men screaming in field hospitals. Families receiving telegrams that began with deep regret. Fighting into Berlin presented the darkest scenario of all. If the war dragged to its ultimate conclusion, American casualties could exceed everything the Western European campaign had cost to date. The mathematics of victory had become a calculus of death. Every mile forward was paid for in precious American lives. Colonel Richard Baxter commanded G2 Intelligence for First Army. His office overlooked the courtyard where staff officers hurried between briefings. Maps covered every wall. Red pins marked German positions. Blue arrows showed planned advances. Each symbol represented human lives hanging in the balance. Baxter had drafted a classified assessment that made uncomfortable reading. December 3, 1944. The report's conclusions challenged fundamental military assumptions. German forces continued organized resistance despite their hopeless strategic position. Logic suggested they should surrender. Mathematics proved they could not win. Yet they fought on with undiminished ferocity. Soldiers fought effectively even when surrounded and cut off from supplies. Their motivation came from ideological commitment rather than rational military calculation. Traditional methods of defeating enemy armies had proven insufficient. Cutting supply lines had little effect. Achieving tactical superiority brought only temporary advantage. Occupying territory didn't break their will to resist. The Wehrmacht operated under different rules. Their soldiers were motivated by fanaticism rather than strategic objectives. This made them far more dangerous than conventional opponents. A rational enemy could be negotiated with. A fanatic had to be completely destroyed. The cost of such destruction might prove politically unsustainable. The Ardennes offensive launched just 13 days after Baxter's report landed on his desk. Every dark prediction came true with terrifying accuracy. German forces, supposedly beaten and broken, had assembled 200,000 men for a major offensive. 500 tanks rolled through the forest. Artillery barrages shattered the morning quiet. American forces found themselves completely surprised. The attack caught Allied commanders flat-footed. Intelligence had failed to detect the massive buildup. German forces had moved with perfect secrecy through the winter darkness. Radio silence had been maintained absolutely. No reconnaissance flights had spotted the concentration. The first sign of trouble came when shells began falling on American positions. Even as the offensive ultimately failed, it demonstrated Wehrmacht continued combat effectiveness. They had achieved complete tactical surprise. Their initial advances carved deep into Allied lines. American units found themselves surrounded and cut off. Some fought to the last man. Others surrendered after brief resistance. Casualty reports from the Ardennes made grim reading when they reached Washington. Between December 16th and January 25th, American forces suffered 19,000 killed in action. Their bodies lay frozen in the snow-covered forest. 47,500 wounded filled field hospitals and evacuation centers. 23,000 were captured or simply missing, gone without a trace in the winter fighting. The Germans had been pushed back eventually. Allied firepower and numerical superiority told in the end, but the cost had been tremendous. German forces had retreated in good order, maintaining unit cohesion. They hadn't broken or panicked. They had conducted a fighting withdrawal that inflicted maximum casualties. Their combat effectiveness remained essentially intact. American commanders faced cruel arithmetic in January 1945. Wehrmacht. Western forces numbered approximately 1.5 million men. Even accounting for equipment losses, their fighting power remained formidable. Even considering reduced combat effectiveness from constant retreating, they demonstrated ability and willingness to inflict casualties at rates that made Allied planners deeply uncomfortable. Every mile of advance was purchased with American lives. Every strategic objective came with a price tag written in blood. The mathematics of victory demanded sacrifices that might prove politically impossible. Public opinion at home was already showing signs of war weariness. How many more telegrams could American families bear? Conventional military wisdom offered only one brutal solution: overwhelming force applied without mercy or restraint. Bomb every German city to rubble and ash. Shell every defensive position until nothing moved. Fight building by building and room by room. Use American industrial might to create such destruction that further resistance became physically impossible. Allied air forces were already implementing this approach with devastating effectiveness. Cities like Dresden had been turned into infernos. Hamburg was a wasteland of twisted steel and broken concrete. Cologne lay in ruins beneath mountains of rubble. Civilian casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Still, German forces fought on. But some American planners were asking a radically different question. The problem wasn't that German soldiers couldn't be killed. Allied firepower could accomplish that task efficiently enough. Artillery shells and aerial bombs were colorblind. They killed German soldiers as effectively as any other nationality. The problem was that killing them required American casualties that were becoming politically unsustainable. Each German death demanded payment in American blood. The exchange rate was becoming economically impossible. What if there was another approach entirely? What if instead of destroying the Wehrmacht, you could simply convince it to stop fighting? That revolutionary question would lead to Operation Tailwind, the most successful psychological warfare campaign in military history. A weapon that attacked the mind rather than the body. A force that made surrender seem rational rather than shameful. The ultimate victory without firing a shot. January 8, 1945, brought bitter cold to the French countryside. Chef headquarters occupied a converted chateau outside Paris. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, had commandeered the elegant building for the duration. Maps covered walls where paintings once hung. Radio equipment filled rooms that once hosted elegant dinner parties. The solution to the German problem emerged not from weapons laboratories or tank factories. It came from the Psychological Warfare Division housed in this repurposed palace. The PWD had been conducting propaganda operations since D-Day with limited success. Leaflet drops produced some surrenders. Radio broadcasts reached German audiences. Loudspeaker appeals across no man's land occasionally worked. But nothing approached the scale needed to affect German combat effectiveness. Thousands of leaflets produced dozens of surrenders. Hours of radio programming convinced handfuls of soldiers. The numbers were encouraging, but strategically insignificant. Something more powerful was needed. Something that could reach into the Wehrmacht's collective mind and change it from within. Captain Harold Denton had arrived at the chateau from Chicago, where he had worked in advertising before the war. Civilian skills proved valuable in military applications. Understanding consumer psychology translated easily to understanding soldier psychology. Both involved convincing people to change their behavior through carefully crafted messages. Denton had been studying surrender patterns since August 1944. His analysis filled 40 pages of classified material dated January 5th. The conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about enemy motivation. German soldiers weren't surrendering because they believed Germany would win. Everyone knew the war was lost. Even German propaganda couldn't hide that reality. They were refusing to surrender despite knowing Germany would lose. This paradox demanded explanation. Logic suggested that soldiers facing certain defeat would choose survival over meaningless death. Reality proved that logic wrong. Other factors were overriding rational self-preservation instincts. The Wehrmacht soldier operated under multiple psychological constraints that made surrender seem impossible. Fear of Soviet capture topped the list. Eastern Front veterans knew what happened to German prisoners in Russian hands. Few returned alive. Those who did brought horrific stories. Better to die fighting than face slow death in Siberian labor camps. Nazi propaganda had poisoned minds against Allied intentions toward prisoners. Goebbels claimed Americans executed captured Germans. Radio broadcasts described torture in Allied prison camps. Leaflets showed staged photographs of prisoner mistreatment. Few German soldiers trusted enemy promises about Geneva Convention protections. Concern for family members remaining in Germany under Nazi observation created another barrier. Gestapo agents watched families of soldiers at the front. Desertion or surrender meant retaliation against wives and children. SS units executed family members of traitors as examples to others. This created powerful motivation to continue fighting. Social pressure from fellow soldiers reinforced individual reluctance to surrender. No one wanted to be labeled coward or traitor by comrades. Military honor demanded fighting to the end regardless of circumstances. Prussian military tradition emphasized duty and sacrifice above personal survival. These values ran deep in German military culture. But Denton had discovered something else through careful analysis of prisoner interrogations. German soldiers who did surrender shared common experiences that separated them from those who fought to the death. They hadn't been convinced by propaganda about inevitable defeat. They already knew that reality better than their enemies. Instead, they had received specific, verifiable information about three critical factors that changed their calculations completely. First proof that American captivity was genuinely safe rather than propaganda, lies. Second evidence that their families would not face Nazi retaliation for their surrender. Third confirmation that surrender was becoming widespread enough that they wouldn't be uniquely dishonored among their comrades. This insight led to Operation Tailwind's revolutionary approach that would change psychological warfare forever. Instead of trying to convince German soldiers to surrender through broad ideological arguments, the program would systematically remove every practical and psychological barrier preventing surrender. The weapon wouldn't be psychological warfare, as traditionally understood with mass propaganda aimed at general audiences. It would be psychological engineering with precise, personalized, verifiable interventions, targeting individual decision-making processes. Each German soldier would receive customized information designed specifically to address his unique concerns and circumstances. The approach required detailed intelligence about individual soldiers and their families. It demanded sophisticated production capabilities to create personalized materials. Most importantly, it needed proof that promises about treatment and safety were genuine rather than propaganda lies. The massive encirclement known as the Ruhr Pocket marked the climactic moment of Operation Tailwind. Here, 317,000 German soldiers found themselves completely surrounded by advancing American forces. This would become the largest mass surrender ever recorded in military history. But these soldiers didn't lay down their weapons because they were beaten in battle. They surrendered because American psychological warfare had made organized resistance mentally impossible. Field Marshal Walter Model commanded the trapped Army Group B. His reputation as a defensive genius meant nothing now. The pocket had closed around him like a steel trap. Inside that trap were the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, and what remained of the 1st Parachute Army. These weren't green recruits or old men. These were battle-hardened units that had fought across Europe with distinction. Model possessed approximately 30 divisions. Many were understrength from months of fighting. But they still had teeth. Tanks rumbled through defensive positions. Artillery pieces pointed outward from concealed positions. The industrial Ruhr region offered countless defensive advantages. Factories could become fortresses. Coal mines could hide reserves. River crossings could be demolished and defended. Any American assault against prepared positions would cost thousands of lives. Model knew this. His officers knew this. They had ammunition. They had defensive positions. They had experienced soldiers who understood urban warfare. Under normal circumstances, reducing the Ruhr Pocket would require weeks of bloody fighting. But these weren't normal circumstances. The enemy wasn't just outside the perimeter, it was inside German mines. American psychological warfare teams had spent months preparing for this moment. As the pocket formed between March 28th and April 1st, PWD aircraft appeared overhead daily. They dropped over 2 million leaflets. These weren't random propaganda drops. Every leaflet targeted specific units known to be trapped inside. The preparation had been extraordinary. Intelligence officers had compiled detailed files on nearly every German unit in the pocket. They knew unit histories going back years. They knew commanding officers' names and reputations. They knew which units had suffered heavy casualties recently. They even knew popular soldiers whose names were recognized throughout entire regiments. The leaflets acknowledged military honor while systematically destroying every logical reason to keep fighting. They didn't insult German soldiers or question their courage. Instead, they spoke to them as professionals who understood military realities. One leaflet targeting the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division appeared on April 2nd. It read like a professional assessment rather than enemy propaganda. The language was respectful, but devastating in its logic. Soldiers of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, your unit has fought with honor from the Normandy beaches to the Rhine River. Your division's courage is recognized even by your enemies. But courage without achievable purpose is not honor. It is waste. The leaflet continued with brutal mathematical clarity. The war is lost. Germany's cities lie in ruins. Your families need you alive to rebuild what has been destroyed. The American Army offers you honorable surrender. You will receive immediate food and medical care. You will have protection under the Geneva Convention. You will be able to communicate rapidly with your families. The message emphasized dignity in defeat. Officers will retain the dignity of their rank during processing. Surrender is not betrayal of duty. It is recognition of changed reality. Your comrades from the 116th Panzer Division, 9th Panzer Division, and 89th Infantry Division have already chosen survival. Join them. Model issued desperate orders forbidding surrender. He threatened courts-martial and immediate execution for any soldier who laid down weapons. His orders revealed growing panic rather than military confidence. On April 8th, he sent a frantic message to OKW headquarters in Berlin. American propaganda operations have achieved what American weapons could not accomplish. They have created destruction of unit cohesion and complete collapse of soldier morale. Officers throughout my command report complete inability to maintain basic discipline. Soldiers openly discuss surrender options. Execution of deserters has become impossible because remaining soldiers refuse to carry out death sentences. Request immediate relief or permission to attempt breakout operations. Berlin's response was predictably harsh. Permission was denied completely. Model received orders to fight to the last man and the last bullet. No breakout attempts would be authorized. No surrender would be acceptable. Instead of inspiring final resistance, these orders accelerated the pocket's internal collapse. American forces advancing into the pocket encountered scenes that defied military logic. Entire battalions waited at rural crossroads, holding white flags made from bedsheets. Supply depots sat intact with guards who surrendered the moment American soldiers appeared. Most remarkably, German officers were taking initiative to surrender their entire commands without any authorization from higher headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson advanced with the 8th Infantry Division through this surreal landscape. His unit diary entry for April 12th captured the bizarre atmosphere perfectly. Reached the village of Altina at 1400 hours. Found the entire 256th Volksgrenadier Division headquarters established in the local schoolhouse. Officers were waiting in perfect formation outside the building. Patterson described the formal surrender ceremony that followed. Division Commander General Major Gerhard Müller formally surrendered for 200 men under his command. Müller explained his decision clearly. Continued resistance serves no military purpose whatsoever. It will only produce casualties that my men's families cannot afford to lose. I take full responsibility for this decision. The Ruhr pocket wasn't falling through military assault. It was dissolving through calculated decisions by thousands of German soldiers. The psychological warfare operations had methodically convinced them that surrender was not just acceptable, but the only rational choice available. Model himself faced an impossible situation. His oath forbade him from ordering surrender. His conscience prevented him from ordering pointless death. On April 21st, he resolved the contradiction by committing suicide. His final message acknowledged complete psychological defeat. The Americans haven't just beaten us militarily. They've convinced us that we are beaten mentally. There's no defense against that kind of warfare. April 18, 1945. The POW Processing Center at Rheinbach, Germany, buzzed with activity. Understanding why Operation Tailwind succeeded required examining not just American actions, but German thought processes. Military psychologists attached to PWD conducted extensive interviews with surrendering soldiers. They compiled data that revealed the systematic psychological transformation that had made mass surrender possible. Dr. Leonard Foster led the interview teams. Before the war, he had been a clinical psychologist at Yale University. Now he wore an Army captain's uniform and carried clipboards instead of textbooks. His classified report, dated April 30, 1945, analyzed testimonies from over 1,400 German prisoners captured during April alone. The findings revealed that surrender resulted not from single factors, but from accumulated psychological pressures. Operation Tailwind had systematically exploited these pressure points with scientific precision. Foster's report explained the typical psychological process experienced by German soldiers who surrendered in April 1945. The process unfolded in predictable stages that could be measured and analyzed. First came acknowledgement of inevitable defeat. Most soldiers had reached this conclusion by February 1945. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Allied air superiority meant German forces moved only at night. Territory was being lost daily on all fronts. Supply shortages affected everything from ammunition to food. Reports from other fronts painted uniformly bleak pictures. However, acknowledging defeat didn't automatically produce surrender. Multiple psychological barriers prevented soldiers from acting on their logical conclusions. Foster termed these obstacles the surrender barrier. They were psychological rather than military obstacles that kept soldiers fighting despite recognizing inevitable defeat. Fear of Soviet-style treatment topped the list of restraining factors. Nazi propaganda had convinced German soldiers that Allied captivity meant torture, starvation, and eventual death. This belief system had to be systematically dismantled through verifiable proof that American captivity was not just survivable, but relatively comfortable. Private testimonies revealed the power of personalized information in overcoming these fears. Gefreiter Anton Weber of the 11th Panzer Division explained his decision to surrender with startling clarity. For 4 months, we all knew Germany would lose the war. But what would happen to us if we were captured? The propaganda said Americans executed prisoners or sent them to slave labor camps in Siberia. Weber described the moment his perspective changed completely. Then I received a leaflet with actual photographs of men from my own regiment. These were men I knew personally who were now in American prison camps. They looked healthy and well-fed. They were actually smiling at the camera. One letter included said the Americans followed the Geneva Convention strictly. We receive Red Cross parcels regularly. I have written to my wife 3 times already. That letter was from my former squad leader. If he said these things, they must be true. Everything changed after that. The second major psychological barrier involved family concerns. Many German soldiers believed their families would face Nazi retaliation if they surrendered. Operation Tailwind's targeting of soldiers whose families lived in Allied-occupied territory directly addressed this fear. The leaflets provided verifiable proof that Nazi authorities no longer controlled those areas and couldn't enforce their threatened punishments. Social pressure constituted the third barrier to surrender. Traditional Prussian military culture, reinforced by Nazi ideology, equated surrender with cowardice and personal betrayal. Foster's interviews revealed that organized unit surrenders overcame this barrier by distributing moral responsibility among multiple people. A single soldier surrendering alone appeared cowardly. A full company surrendering together under officer orders maintained collective honor. The psychological warfare teams had understood this social dynamic instinctively. Their leaflets increasingly emphasized organized surrender options that preserved group dignity. A leaflet dropped on the 326th Volksgrenadier Division in early April made this approach explicit. Military honor is not found in pointless death. Honor is found in preserving your men's lives when military objectives can no longer be achieved. Officers who arrange organized surrender demonstrate leadership and practical wisdom. Your men's families will thank you for bringing their sons and husbands home alive. Perhaps most remarkably, Foster's interviews revealed that many German soldiers felt genuine relief at receiving permission to surrender through American psychological warfare materials. Wehrmacht discipline and ideological indoctrination had created severe internal psychological conflicts. Soldiers simultaneously knew continuation was futile, but felt unable to act on that knowledge without external validation. The American leaflets, explained Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich of the 276th Infantry Division, gave us exactly what we needed. They provided a rational framework for making a decision we already wanted to make but couldn't admit to ourselves. When the leaflets acknowledged our courage and recognized our military honor, when they explained that organized surrender was completely legitimate and provided specific instructions for safely surrendering, it removed the psychological burden completely. We weren't traitors abandoning our posts. We were rational men making sensible decisions based on dramatically changed circumstances. Operation Tailwind had achieved something remarkable in military history. It had transformed surrender from an act of individual cowardice into an act of collective rational self-preservation. It changed surrender from personal betrayal into group wisdom. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The final statistical accounting of Operation Tailwind's success revealed something unprecedented in the annals of military history. The program had achieved what conventional military operations had consistently failed to accomplish. It had systematically dismantled enemy combat effectiveness without proportional expenditure of ammunition, casualties, or precious time. The Classified War Department analysis completed in June 1945 by the Operations Research Office quantified the program's extraordinary impact with mathematical precision. Between February 1st and May 8, 1945, approximately 512,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces throughout the Western theater of operations. Post-surrender interviews indicated that roughly 73% of these surrenders, approximately 374,000 individual soldiers, cited psychological warfare materials as either primary or significant contributing factors in their personal decisions to surrender. The numbers represented human beings who had chosen survival over continued resistance. The casualty mathematics were absolutely staggering when examined closely. Traditional combat operations throughout the European theater had produced roughly 1 German soldier killed or wounded for every 15 artillery shells fired. The ratio was 1 casualty per 40 rifle rounds expended. These ratios had been calculated from months of combat data across multiple campaigns. Using these established ratios, killing or incapacitating 374,000 German soldiers through conventional combat operations would have required approximately 5.6 million artillery rounds and 14.9 million rifle rounds. These calculations didn't include proportional expenditures of tank ammunition, air ordnance, mortar rounds, and other munitions that would have been necessary. More significantly for American planning, casualty projections based on earlier campaign experience suggested disturbing numbers. Inflicting 374,000 German casualties through conventional combat operations would have produced approximately 93,000 American casualties. This represented the historical ratio of roughly 1 American casualty for every 4 enemy casualties. This ratio had been consistently observed during the drive across France and into Germany. Operation Tailwind had achieved equivalent enemy force reduction at a cost of approximately $2.3 million. This included printing costs, aircraft fuel for leaflet drops, and personnel costs for the entire psychological warfare operation. Most remarkably, the program produced 0 American combat casualties directly attributable to the psychological warfare operations themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Morrison served as chief analyst for the Operations Research Office. His assessment noted the fundamental transformation in military economics that Operation Tailwind represented. Each German soldier convinced to surrender through psychological warfare represented not only one less enemy combatant. Each surrender also represented ammunition not expended, American casualties not suffered, time not spent in prolonged combat operations, and infrastructure not destroyed unnecessarily. The program achieved military objectives more efficiently than any conventional weapon system deployed during the entire war. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate military efficiency calculations. Every German soldier who surrendered required processing, transport, housing, and regular feeding. But each prisoner also became a valuable source of intelligence information. Each became a living testimonial for future psychological warfare operations. Most importantly, each became a breathing contradiction to Nazi propaganda claims about American treatment of prisoners. The 512,000 German prisoners in American hands by May 8th represented more than just defeated enemies. They represented concrete proof that American assurances about proper prisoner treatment were completely genuine. Word spread through remaining German units that surrender meant survival rather than death. The broader strategic impact became visible in German defensive capabilities during the war's final months. Wehrmacht commanders consistently reported to OKW headquarters that planned defensive operations could not be executed. Units were melting away through desertion and surrender before combat even began. Operations that might have cost thousands of American casualties were preempted because German units ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Third Army intelligence estimated that Operation Tailwind had reduced German combat effectiveness in their sector by approximately 40% beyond what could be attributed to conventional combat losses alone. Units that appeared intact on German order of battle charts existed only on paper. They had dissolved through psychological collapse rather than battlefield defeat. General Dwight Eisenhower gave unusual prominence to psychological warfare operations in his final report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff. The systematic application of psychological warfare, particularly Operation Tailwind's targeted approach, contributed materially to the rapid conclusion of the European campaign. Enemy forces were defeated as much by erosion of will to resist as by application of military force. This strongly suggests that future military operations must consider psychological dimensions as seriously as logistical or tactical factors. Perhaps most tellingly, German military analysts conducting post-war assessments for American intelligence identified Operation Tailwind as one of the three most decisive factors in Wehrmacht collapse. They ranked it alongside Allied air superiority and Soviet advances from the Eastern Front. The weapon that convinced 500,000 German soldiers to drop their rifles had proven as strategically significant as any conventional weapon system deployed during the entire war. June 15, 1945. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, witnessed the establishment of the Psychological Warfare School. The success of Operation Tailwind had fundamentally altered American military doctrine. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, the War Department established this specialized school. Its mission was codifying lessons learned and training specialists for anticipated operations against Japan and future conflicts. The doctrinal shift represented profound changes in military thinking. Military theorists had long recognized morale as an important factor in combat effectiveness. But Operation Tailwind had demonstrated something more radical and transformative. Psychological operations could serve as a primary weapon system rather than merely supporting conventional operations. A classified strategy paper dated July 1945 stated the new reality bluntly. In modern warfare between industrial powers, victory may be achieved more efficiently through systematic erosion of enemy will than through physical destruction of enemy forces. The human mind represents a target that can be influenced more readily than fortified positions can be destroyed. The human legacy proved equally significant for individual lives saved. For the 512,000 German soldiers who surrendered to American forces during those final months, Operation Tailwind meant the difference between death and survival. Post-war studies conducted by the Veterans Administration tracked these former prisoners through repatriation and beyond into civilian life. Mortality rates among German soldiers captured by Americans averaged 0.15% during captivity. This was vastly lower than mortality rates among soldiers who fought to the bitter end or were captured by Soviet forces. The numbers represented tens of thousands of lives preserved through psychological warfare rather than ended through conventional combat. Klaus Zimmermann surrendered as an Obergefreiter with the 89th Infantry Division on March 24, 1945. His memoir, published in 1967, captured the personal impact of Operation Tailwind with moving clarity. The American leaflet saved my life, not by convincing me the war was lost. I already knew that terrible truth, but by showing me that surrender was actually possible, that I could choose survival without losing personal honor. Zimmermann continued describing his post-war life. I returned to my family in 1946. I rebuilt our farm from rubble. I raised 4 children who never knew hunger or war. I lived to see my grandchildren born into a peaceful world. Tens of thousands of my former comrades who fought longer are lying in unmarked graves. The Americans understood what our own commanders refused to accept. Soldiers are human beings, not expendable machines. Men can be convinced more easily than they can be killed. The ethical dimensions sparked intense debate within American military circles. These discussions continued for decades after the war's end. Some officers argued that psychological warfare crossed moral boundaries by targeting human psychology rather than military capability. Others countered that any method achieving military objectives while reducing casualties on both sides represented genuine moral progress. Chaplin reports from 1945 revealed that American psychological warfare personnel struggled with their role more than anticipated. Captain Harold Denton, whose intelligence analysis had helped shape Operation Tailwind, wrote in a personal letter dated May 15, 1945. His words captured the moral complexity involved. We convinced hundreds of thousands of men to abandon their posts, their comrades, their duties as they understood them. We accomplished this through calculated manipulation of their deepest fears, their strongest hopes, their love for their families. That it saved lives, both theirs and ours, doesn't eliminate the moral complexity of deliberately engineering human behavior on such massive scale. The technical innovations developed during Operation Tailwind lived on in American military doctrine. The concept of personalized psychological operations, enabled by rapid intelligence processing and flexible production systems, became standard practice. Modern military information operations trace direct lineage to techniques developed during Operation Tailwind. These include targeted messaging, rapid feedback loops, multimedia integration, and above all, the principle that credible, verifiable information defeats propaganda every single time. The deepest legacy lay in recognition that modern warfare had expanded beyond traditional physical domains. Land, sea, and air forces projected conventional military power across geographic space. But psychological operations projected something potentially more decisive. They projected the power to convince enemies that resistance was completely futile before battles even began. The weapon that made 500,000 German soldiers drop their rifles wasn't bombs or bullets. It was something simultaneously more insidious and more humane. It was the systematic application of information warfare that made continuing to fight psychologically impossible rather than physically impossible. The Americans had discovered that in the brutal arithmetic of modern war, a leaflet that saves a life counts for more than a bullet that takes one. On May 8, 1945, when the guns finally fell silent across Europe, victory belonged not just to the army with superior weapons. Victory belonged to the army that understood the human mind could be influenced more efficiently than the human body could be destroyed. Operation Tailwind had proven that in modern warfare, the most devastating weapon doesn't kill the enemy. Instead, it convinces the enemy to stop fighting entirely. The flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima had demonstrated the power of technology to overcome physical defenses through brute force. Operation Tailwind demonstrated something even more profound. Information, properly applied, could overcome the human will to resist without destroying the human being. Both weapons saved American lives through different means, but only one showed that victory could be achieved by giving enemies a reason to live rather than a reason to die. That distinction defined not just military innovation, but represented moral progress in the conduct of warfare itself. The lessons learned would echo through decades of future conflicts, proving that sometimes the mightiest weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that persuades.